Welcome to Jewish Cinémathèque, where we meet some of the important faces involved with films that tackle aspects of the Jewish experience. Today I am joined by filmmaker Roberta Grossman, the director of such films as Hava Nagila the movie, Blessed is the Match, the Life and Death of Chana Senesh, and Above and Beyond. Most recently, she wrote and directed Who Will Write Our History, about the Oyneg Shabes Archive, an effort by Dr. Emanuel Ringelblum and a group of dedicated scholars, rabbis, and volunteers to tell the story of Jewish life during the Shoah and then find a way to preserve that treasure for future generations. Roberta, welcome to Jewish Cinémathèque.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's, watching Who Will Write Our History, as a film historian, it's just so special because you delved into the efforts. In effect, they were risking their lives to preserve, to narrate their story from a Jewish perspective. What drew you to this story?
I was actually starting another film, we're doing in the research stage for another film that was set in the interwar Polish-Jewish world. And I read a review of Sam Kassow's book, Who Will Write Our History. I got the book. 10 pages in, I realized, oh my God, this is the most important unknown story outside of academic circles. Of course, Sam's book was amazing, but this is the most important unknown story of the Holocaust. And I realized right then and there that I had to drop everything and devote myself to telling this story.
So what is the story?
The story is, in essence, about Emanuel Ringelblum, who was a Jewish historian. He was also an activist and had been involved in social work, Jewish self-help, even before the war. And in the ghetto, he realized immediately that something that had never happened before in history was happening.
How early did this happen?
He started keeping his personal diary the day the war started. But in terms of the Oyneg Shabes gathering others around him, and he ultimately gathered about 60 other people around him, and they would make up the core of the Oyneg Shabes members, that first meeting of the Oyneg Shabes took place in his apartment 8 days after the ghetto was closed in November 1940, so it was pretty quick. And he really chose a diverse group of people, men, women, secular people, religious people, left, right, all different kinds of people, scholars, journalists, poets, statisticians, mathematicians, sociologists, everyone. And he would lay out for them really specific things. In addition to saying, write your own diary and write every day, he would give people assignments. You write about Jewish women in the ghetto, you write about children in the ghetto. So he was creating an archive, he was directing the creation of an archive. There were also people's diaries and writings that were collected by members of the Oyneg Shabes who didn't know that they were being collected for the archive. They had to keep everything very, very secret because the Nazis, as you well know, did not take very kindly to any kind of underground activity, which this was, or any kind of collecting of evidence of Nazi crimes, which this was, and any kind of Jewish communal life was frowned upon and met with indiscriminate death. So they really were risking their lives to document what was happening from their own point of view.
You chose to approach this through a mix of documentary and dramatic effect. So why did you choose that way to go? I mean, you've made films of different kinds. You're a documentarian primarily, but here you inject that narrative feel.
Well,
and by the way, it's amazing. I mean, the sets you created. Wow.
Well, that wasn't me exactly. That was an amazing production design team. The production designers worked with scholars in Poland for about 6 months before we arrived. Because it is, I consider the film to be a documentary with dramatic elements. But because of that hybrid nature of the film, if it was to hold up on either side of that divide, it had to be excruciatingly authentic. Nothing could be done in an easy or sloppy way. So, for example, the pens on Ringelblum's desk or the books in his library, all of that was reviewed by scholars of the period. Why did I choose to tell it that way? Well, we have come to think of archival footage. Normally, we think, just stop and think for a second. Archival footage and photographs we accept as being true, or the truth, without questioning, pretty much. That's what happened. When we think of dramatizations, we think of those as being suspect in some way because they're being created after the fact. I'd like to argue that this film turns that on its head because the archival material was shot by the German propaganda units in the ghetto with the very specific purpose of making the Jews look as terrible as possible. And the dramatizations that I shot, that I created, are all based very, very closely, word for word, on the writings of the archive.
Wow. So you actually sat down with this material, and I from what I understand, it's all sitting in Warsaw. Mm-hmm. We've not been able to, to take it out of there. It's been restored with foundation funds, and so you had to sit there and sift through it with your researchers.
Yes, I mean, Sam's book, Who Will Write Our History, was obviously the basis, the biggest guide. And then Ringelblum's diary has been translated into English for decades. Abraham Lewin's diary was translated.
One of the other members of the archive group.
And a key character in the film. His diary was translated years ago under the title A Cup of Tears. Recently, Rabbi Huberman, another member of the Oyneg Shabes Archive, his daily diary had been translated. The biggest difficulty was I chose to tell the film from the point of view of Rachel Auerbach, who was a member of the archive, because she was part of Ringelblum's milieu before the war, Jewish, Yiddish intellectual. She was there in the ghetto as part of the Oyneg Shabes. She ran a soup kitchen. She was writing all during the war. And then she was one of 3 members of the 60 members of the Oyneg Shabes who survived. And she spent the rest of her life writing about Ringelblum, the archive, the Jewish experience during the war, before the war. So she was the perfect narrator and was a magnificent writer. But her writing, beyond 2 pieces, had never been translated.
You begin the film with a train. And for anyone watching a film, you're sort of sensing it's the Holocaust and you're seeing a train, but it's Rachel Auerbach after the war coming back to uncover this material. I mean, that choice was just to talk about life, death.
It wasn't a conscious choice to make the connection to the trains, which are, of course, the most obvious symbol of the fate of 6 million Jews.
The deportations, yes.
Yeah. But in this case, it was really cinematically, a stranger comes to town. Mm-hmm. She's moving. And I think that she was such a driving force behind uncovering of the archive, that sense of her, when Warsaw was completely destroyed in various stages during the war, but the final stage was 1944 with the Polish uprising, and after that uprising was put down, the Germans pretty much, everybody had to move, destroy the city, and very, very few people stayed in Warsaw, and most of the Jewish survivors, or whoever was there, went to Lodz, and it was in Lodz that she found out that the people who were digging for the archive, at her insistence, had hit something. So she was on her way back with some urgency to find out what had happened with the archive. This
was an archive that was found soon after the war, and then apparently from what you explained, there was another cache that was found years later, and there still may be a third treasure buried somewhere. Did we not know about this in the United States? Was this sort of like a secret that was sitting in Eastern Europe under the Russian, why is it something that typically we just didn't learn about early on?
It's a great question because, in Jerusalem, we have a beautiful museum for the Dead Sea Scrolls, and scholars have been very publicly studying it, international scholars, and reporting on, and writing papers about it. I consider the Oyneg Shabes Archive to be, the Dead Sea Scrolls coming out of the rubble of the ghetto of equal, if not greater importance. So the question of why have we not known about it, and why did I not know about it? I'd spent my entire life reading about and learning about the Holocaust from the time I was 12 years old.
Right, one of your earliest films was about Hannah Senech.
Right, and even Havana Gilo, the movie, touches on the Holocaust. And of course, Above and Beyond, the American Jewish pilots were compelled to go to Israel after they survived World War II because of the Holocaust. So, and I studied the SS in college. This is my subject. I'm the person who reads Chaim Kaplan's Scroll of Agony on the beach. Okay, so the fact that I didn't
that
know
must be fun reading.
It is, and the fact that I didn't know about it was really, that's very shocking. I'm not saying that I'm the greatest Holocaust scholar in the world, but this is my obsession. Why didn't we know about it? Well, Sam Kassow and David Roski is another scholar in the film. They talk about a couple of reasons. One is because the archive did stay in Warsaw at the Jewish Historical Institute, so it wasn't readily accessible because it was behind the Iron Curtain. It wasn't until the fall of the Berlin Wall that really the funds were able to come in to begin to translate and digitize and make the archive more accessible. That's number one. Number two, the archive is written primarily in Yiddish and Polish. They're not international languages of study, of scholarship. And then there wasn't the funds and even the awareness to translate the material. And three, after the war, according to both Sam and David Roski's, after the war, as Jews were assimilating this unfathomable disaster in the diaspora, also in Israel, there was a need for a simplicity that everyone who died was a martyr, and those who survived fighting, or those who fought with arms, however limited they may be, were those to be lifted up and lauded. So this kind of very Jewish diaspora-ish resistance of writing and recording, writing poetry, writing essays, writing reportage, collecting photographs and paintings, diaries of children. This was not seen or understood as the tremendous resistance that it actually was. And finally, Ringelblum was a historian, and he was a historian from the ground up. He was trained really at YIVO. I mean, he had a PhD, but his methods were from the bottom up, the common person, not the top down. And he also wanted to make sure, as a historian, and especially as the events became more and more extreme, he wanted to make sure that we in the future would believe what we were reading because it included everything, the bad and the good. So, for example, there is a great deal of writing about the role of the Jewish police in the Great Deportation and the brutality of the Jewish police. There's a tremendous amount of writing that's not in the archive. That's
not something we often like to talk about.
Right. There's in the film, Abraham Lewin is a portion of his diary where he says, who has raised these bitter fruit amongst us, right? He's talking about an 8-year-old girl being grabbed by a Jewish policeman, and she's screaming, "Mommy, Mommy." So he also taught, there's Jewish prostitutes, there's, they hated the Judenrat, the members of the Oyneg Shabes, rightly or wrongly, a little bit.
Judenrat being the council that was in charge.
There's corruption, there's greed, there's black marketeering when people are starving. So there's that on one hand. And on the other hand, there's this enormous record of everyday kindnesses, people giving their last piece of bread to somebody who's hungry, or women who are taking care of orphan children, or the hundreds of soup kitchens, fighting mightily against hunger by serving those who had no other food. So he really wanted the whole story to be told, good and bad, because after all, these were human beings, and I don't judge because I have no idea how I would behave in such extreme circumstances. But Ringelblum wanted all parts of the story. So, for example, it's not in the film, but he writes in his diary, there's been a tremendous loosening or lessening of kinship ties in the ghetto. And he goes on to explain that the Gestapo come to an apartment, they burst in, they go to a specific painting, take it off the wall, and there is hidden the family's last remaining money and jewels, which they take. And he says, who but a family member would know where this was? So, and he also talks about what he calls the common decency of the everyday person.
And in the film, you dramatize both of these worlds.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes it's difficult to watch. I mean, there was one dramatization where a man is one of the Oyneg Shabes groups walking down the street, and at a certain point he turns around and he's walking backwards and he stumbles over a dead child. I mean,
so this is a perfect example of that those dramatizations are directly from the writing. That's from Goldman's Chronicle of a Single Day, which is his chronicle of 24 hours of his own hunger.
so he just, that was just collected and put in there, and otherwise we never would have known about it. It was put in that cache, put down under the ground, and hopefully somebody would find it after the war, which we did.
Right.
And what does he do in that chronicle? What does he tell us?
He tells us that he wakes up hungry, that he doesn't get his bowl of soup until 1 o'clock. How's he going to spend that time? He goes walking in the street, and the whole thing is an argument really between his stomach and himself. So his stomach is kind of a brute. He's yelling at him and suggesting that he grab. The stomach is an animal, right? The stomach is hungry. Feed me. And is mocking him, the writer, the intellectual, like, so it's great that you're reading and your philosophy and you're arguing about dialectics. What good is that doing you now? You stupid intellectual. So basically, he's spending the day grappling with: Are we still human? Are we our stomachs, or are we still human beings? And at the end, he decides we are human beings, because at the end of the day, he happens upon a window where he can see inside, and there's an operation going on, and they're operating on a Jewish child. And he said animals don't operate on their children, because at first it's like, what is this child being saved for? What is it being brought back for into this hellish world? But he decides that this act of trying to save the child is an act of human beings. So it's all about ethical choices. A lot of their writing is about ethical choices and ethical dilemmas in the most difficult circumstances. In terms of tripping over the body, he, at some point in his wandering around the ghetto trying to wait until his soup is going to be available, he trips over a dead body in the street. And the reason he trips is
and there were many dead bodies on the street.
The reason he trips is that he's watching somebody walk out of a bakery, a rich Jewish woman with her child, walking out of the bakery with a loaf of bread. And he's so transfixed by the loaf of bread that this causes him not to see the dead body at his feet. So I didn't make any of that up. That's all from the writing, word for word.
You watch that, and it's a story about World War II and about the 1940s, but it's so relevant in today's world with the whole question of hunger all across the world. Did you, as you were thinking this through and developing the script, was this an issue in terms of relevance, or you really just wanted to focus in on that period?
Well, I would say that it's relevant on many other levels besides hunger. This is a film about people who were literally willing to die for the truth, that's come out at a time that I could not have foreseen, when lies and propaganda are being wielded as tools of propaganda to gain power, as they were in the 30s. So there was no way 8 years ago, when I started working on the film, that I would know that at the top levels of government, we would have somebody shouting fake news.
All across the world.
All across the world. Right, all across the world. Those who are aspiring to more and more total control are attacking the press, because truth is the first thing to go if you want to be a strong man. So I had no idea. So hunger, refugees, the truth, propaganda, the insidious effects of demonizing the other as another method of gaining power. Who could have known?
You began this, it's not as if you started making Jewish films 10 years ago. You've been making films for many, many years. What moved you in the direction of Jewish, and were you concerned about that? Being typecast, Roberta Grossman, she's the Jewish filmmaker.
I think about it all the time. I'm not ashamed to be considered the Jewish filmmaker, but sometimes it's very upsetting that my films, which I, if you don't mind me saying, I think are pretty darn good.
They are darn good. That's why you're here.
They get pigeonholed and often don't get accepted, for example, to mainstream film festivals. They're only seen in the Jewish film festivals. I love the Jewish film festivals. But, as a filmmaker, I would appreciate a larger audience, and also that these stories be told to outside of a Jewish audience. I love Jewish history. So I get drawn into these stories because it takes between 2 to, in this case, 8 years to make a film. So it has to be a subject that holds infinite interest, and Jewish history does for me. My heart goes to these Jewish stories, and especially ones that I feel will be lost to history if they're not properly archived. And I think of what I've done over the last decade with these Jewish films as creating my own sort of box set or archive of Jewish history. And I'm good with that, because I think that people in our day and age, especially kids, they learn history through film.
Absolutely. Let's take a break now and look at a clip from the film Who Will Write Our History?
Jews were removed from all posts in government and Aryan-owned enterprises. Their bank accounts frozen. They were not allowed to use railways or buses, to go to theaters or cinemas. February 7th, 1940. Jewish women were seized for labor. And it just so happened, women in fur coats, they're ordered to wash the pavement with their panties and put them on again wet. February 23rd. Nalevsky Street looks like Hollywood these days. Everywhere you go, you see a star. Today, 29th of September, got a blow to the mouth for not saluting a German.
Jews of Warsaw, and as a matter of fact, Jews of Poland, it didn't take long for them to come to a conclusion that the worst scenario was in the process of happening. I mean, all kinds of indignities. It started as soon as the Germans arrived, forcing them to perform humiliating labor. Jews being pushed literally into the gutter.
In today's world, Israel remains a controversial subject, not just for Americans, Europeans, but even for Jews. You decided to make a film called Above and Beyond several years ago, which focuses in on the flyers, the American aviators who went over and volunteered. You yourself are a product of the Zionist youth movement. I believe you were in Hashomer Tzair.
Correct.
So why, and I must tell you, people walked out of that film. I was at screenings where people walked out, they were standing up straight. Wow, look at us. It was like the feel-good kind of let's celebrate Israel, which you don't see a lot of.
I really love the story of Above and Beyond, because these guys, these pilots, these Jewish pilots were, for the most part, pretty assimilated American Jews. And they made the decision to risk their lives for the emerging state of Israel. And I love the story of how Israel came to be, and the impulses that went into it, and I'm a Zionist, I'm a left Zionist, but I'm a Zionist. I believe that if you believe in the right to self-determination to any people, then you need to believe in the right to self-determination for every people. So I've always believed in a two-state solution. I'm not happy with the current I'm not happy with the current Israeli government and the expansion of settlements. On the other hand, I don't think that we can afford as a Jewish people to have a world without Israel. And I love Israel and the beautiful culture and society that's been created there. I think you can hold both things in one hand. I think you can be very critical, as I am, of the most recent government's stance on expansion of the settlements and treatment of Arabs. But on the other hand, you can still hold in your hand, as I do, a love for the Jewish people and the Jewish state. That's part of the Jewish experience. So I don't think those two things are contradictory. I will say it was quite an interesting experience to premiere Above and Beyond, which is unabashedly Zionist, about the Israeli Air Force, the birth of the Israeli Air Force. It was at the San Francisco Jewish Film Festival in 2008. And just at that moment, the Israeli Air Force was bombing Gaza.
Wow.
So, and this was in very progressive San Francisco, right, that the film was screening. And it was quite a uncomfortable moment. But people loved the film, and I believe that you don't get to hear that narrative very often of what the founding ideals were of the state. And I feel like until we hear each other's narratives, we're never going to have peace.
Future projects. Right now you're involved in producing Laura Bialas's film about Roman Vishniak,
right,
the amazing photographer who captured Eastern European Jewish life before the war, and your own project that you'll be writing, directing, and producing about Abraham Joshua Heschel. Can you just tell us why you were drawn first to the production and then to the film that really you're going to be doing totally on your own? Well, with your cast and crew.
Abraham Joshua Heschel is one of the great figures of Jewish life, and really one of the great figures, period, without putting Jewish before his name, of the 20th century. And there's never been, although there have been some in the works for decades, there's never been a feature-length documentary biography of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And I think that I'm drawn to it because of the nature of his message, the complexity of his thought, the beauty of his spirit, and his relevance for today. And it's just an excuse for me to get to dive into his work and his life and his times and his philosophy, very deeply. And again, it has a Holocaust component. He was a refugee. He was brought. He called himself a fire plucked from the brand. He was brought from Europe in 1940, so quite late, to the United States. And in great part, his writing about God and faith and prayer and radical amazement and how to live a Jewish life and how to live a life with awareness of God and to be aware of the need to listen to the call of the prophets for social justice. This is all in the context, I believe, of his response to losing a great part of his family in the Holocaust. And also just as a Jewish person, how do you respond?
So you've got quite a challenge there.
It's impossible.
Yeah. Well, we're looking forward to that and to all future works. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. And we're especially pleased to remind you that thanks to a generous matching gift from the Cayley family, every new or increased dollar you donate to JBS will be worth double to JBS. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.